So you cannot be a journalist without understanding the First Amendment. And it's actually quite sad, but there are only about 25% of people in our country who can list the five freedoms protected by the First Amendment. So please memorize those: religion, speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and freedom to petition the government. Absolutely, freedom of speech is something that we're going to be talking about when we talk about journalists' rights. It doesn't mean that anything goes, because there are parameters that we will talk about. The biggest landmark case surrounding journalism is the Tinker case. And this happened during the Vietnam War when Mary Beth Tinker and her brother, one was a middle school student, I believe, and one was a high school student at the time, wore black armbands to school in a silent protest against the Vietnam War. And they were sent home from school and suspended, and they took it to court and eventually went to the Supreme Court and said that it was freedom of speech. Their freedom of speech was violated in a public school because they were not causing any sort of disruption, that they had the right in Iowa, where this took place. They had the right to peacefully protest with the armband. And that basically set a precedent for other schools and journalists to say that as long as students are not vulgar or causing disruption, causing harm to victims, that the administration cannot intervene. Then, years later, in 1988, there was a bit of a change to these protections in the Hazelwood case. And so here, this affected journalists because it said that if you are writing or speaking or taking pictures for a school-sponsored class or club, that the school did have the right to censor you, or to, what's the word I'm looking for? The school had the right to punish, I guess, you. And so the Hazelwood case applies to some schools, not all, which we'll talk about, but basically says that if your advisor is paid to oversee your activity or club or class and it's sponsored by the school, then the school has ultimate authority on what you can publish and communicate. So that kind of changed the Tinker precedent when that came along. The exception to this, which is new in the last 5 years or so, is if your school has set up protections for your journalism program, saying that your program is operating under a public forum under the New Voices law. And what that means is that actual legislation has taken place in your state under the New Voices law to protect you. And then you would basically state that on your website and in your publications, saying that you have those extra protections, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the First Amendment, as we talked about in the Tinker case and then a little bit overturned in the Hazelwood case, it does give you the right to free speech and free press, but you cannot libel anyone, which means that you published a lie. It's unsubstantiated. There is no evidence to prove it. So it is a lie that could damage someone's reputation, and that is published. If you have invaded their privacy, so you haven't followed ethics, which we talked about last week, or you're creating a clear and present danger, so you do something that puts others in harm's way, then you are not, under these three stipulations, protected by the First Amendment. You are protected if you are not violating any of those things. Just because you're publishing something that's maybe unpopular or that the school district would not like published, then schools are not supposed to be able to censor you as long as you're not committing those acts. facts mentioned above. So in the Tinker case, which I mentioned earlier, because the students were not causing a substantial disruption to the learning environment, they ultimately won their case. So they were suspended for wearing the armbands, but nobody was disrupted. It didn't cause a riot or anything. And so their First Amendment speech rights were violated, the Supreme Court decided. In another case in 1986, Bethel versus Frazier, this case established that schools do have the right to intervene for obscene or sexually inappropriate speech. So a student was giving, I think it was either like a nomination speech or a graduation speech. It was at an assembly. So I think it was like for school president or something. And he had it loaded with sexual innuendo. And in that case, the school was right in punishing him because protections are not limited to sexually vulgar speech in a school context. So again, just another thing, yes, there's free speech, but not if it is crude or vulgar or hurtful or harmful or untrue. So the Hazelwood case, which somewhat overturned the Tinker case, this is really interesting because, again, there are a lot of hot topics in high schools that school boards, principals, superintendents do not want getting out. Doesn't mean it's not news. No. It's just not favorable news. And we have run into this in the past. So we have to be careful that we are doing our job ethically and that we are following all of the standards. And as long as we do that and we don't break any of those ethical violations, we should not be censored. But it doesn't always go that way. Sometimes there are some very sensitive cases. And so that's why I'm just going to go ahead here to the New Voices law. That's why many states have instituted the New Voices law to protect them, because the states that have passed New Voices law, basically those high school journalists are treated like any professional journalist. There can be no censorship by their administration or school boards based on their work. So that is a totally separate thing that has to go through legislation. 14 states have passed this law. We have tried in Wisconsin, but have not been successful. We will continue to try. These states that are listed here, those student journalists basically have all the same rights as professional journalists. They don't have to tiptoe around sensitive issues and worry about getting censored. I will say that a lot of it comes down to your relationship with your administration. We do have listed, if you look at our website, we do have the policy for our publication and how it works. Ultimately, at this point, the school board, the administration does have ultimate say about what we do because we are not a New Voices state. But I would say, unlike other schools, we do not get censored ever or very rarely, and not recently, because we haven't pushed the envelope with many stories recently. But basically, because we don't have the protections of New Voices, that could still happen. We are not a public forum. We are not protected by New Voices. So we are basically operating under the Hazelwood standard right now. Okay, so this kind of puts that all together, that we are protected on some level, but it is basically up to how we do our job, the trust that we have from our community and from our administration.